Hi and welcome to modeling and texturing photoreal environments using Agisoft PhotoScan, Autodesk Maya and Pixologic ZBrush. This training series is going to be covering the creation of a photoreal environment which can be used in high-end VFX, VR cinema, or it can be used in real-time VR cinema in Unreal Engine 4. Some of the prerequisites for real-time VR include having all of the scene made out of polygons instead of RI curves or other render time geometry which isn't visible in the viewport. And the other prerequisite is that the models have to be able to be loaded into the Unreal Engine software, and a lot of pre-rendered data which is used in different VFX pipelines. It offloads the heavy geometry, dynamic simulations, leaves for and all kinds of other systems into the supercomputers for render time, and there's very lightweight scenes actually in the viewport that the artists use to animate the VFX stereo movies. So basically, this is going to cover a new pipeline which is going to have interchangeable assets which can be used in both a VFX pipeline and also a VR real-time 3D cinema pipeline. The objective is to, of course, create a photoreal environment which is like Ready Player One or The Matrix, where you've got this extremely believable, fully immersive environment which is able to trick the brain into thinking that you're actually there in the place that you're looking at, while at the same time having the additional option of having those assets be used not only in HDR 4K movies, which would go on Netflix or go to the cinema, but also in Oculus Rift and HTC Vive VR applications. We're going to have a look at the different ways of modeling and texturing photoreal environments for next-gen VR cinema, and we're also going to be having a look at how to create models, textured, modeled, highly detailed objects in more efficient workflows other than the traditional subdivision polygon modeling. So let's get started, and we'll jump in and have a look at some of the content we'll be using in this course. Now, this course is going to be covering the creation of 5 levels of detail of correctly topologized models which have extremely high resolution texture maps on them. So that's what you'll get by the end of this course is you'll have the skills and the ability to create all kinds of different objects and sections of environment which have very highly detailed models, but they won't just be sort of like a white mess of triangles. They'll be correctly topologized and have several levels of detail that you can use for mobile phone games, next-gen consoles, VFX, and all kinds of other 3D applications. So that's basically what you'll get, is a textured model ready for the lighting pipeline or real-time use in Unreal Engine. Basically what we're going to get started with is we're going to have a look at a piece of software called Agisoft PhotoScan, and we're going to have a brief discussion about the different ways that you can create visual effects assets in 3D software packages. So let's have a look at that now. The traditional pipeline for creating 3D assets in a visual effects or game pipeline in the late 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, and late 2000s was to create a polygon object of the 3D object using reference photography. So what you might have is a photo that's from the side like this, a photo from the front of an object, and a photo from the top if you're lucky. And from that, in Maya or 3D Studio Max or Softimage, you would model as best as your approximation could get you to the shape of the object at low polygon level. Then what you would do is subdivide the polygons and then add in extra detail along the edges and the creases of the model so that you're able to have a second layer of detail on the model. And then you would basically hit the smooth key and it would subdivide the model further and soften off the edges and add in sort of like a high polygon smoothness across the object. So to have a quick look at that now, I'll load in a polygon model in Maya and I'll just show you quickly how that works. So I've got here a Beretta 92 FS, which has been modeled in probably 3D Studio Max. And you can see here that the level 1 level of detail has the polygons sort of in this low to medium-ish polygon state. And the way that you get the detail out of it is by smoothing this geometry. So if I press the 3 key in Maya, we now get a detailed model of this object. So that's basically the pipeline and the workflow for traditional modeling and traditional asset creation using 3D software packages. Is you have this sort of low resolution cage mesh, which then gets smoothed off using subdivision to add all the curvature and all the detail into the model. And then on top of that, in software like Substance Designer and ZBrush, artists create displacement maps and normal maps and multi-layered texture maps into their shaders to give details like scuff marks, fingerprints, the patterns on the grips, and all kinds of other details that they want to put in the model. So that's the traditional way. So you basically start with a low detail mesh, and then basically you work your way upwards to higher and higher and higher levels of detail through ZBrush and shaders and things like that. Now, if we now close this and we go and have a look at another piece of software, we'll see that it almost works in the opposite way. So the software is called Agisoft PhotoScan, and it's a great piece of software as of 2017 and 2018 for building photogrammetry. Now, what photogrammetry actually is the recreation of very detailed, mathematically correct 3D objects with texture maps using photographs. So how it basically works is you get an object and you take photos of the object using a digital SLR. So this is the photos I've taken of this rock, which was a test object. And you basically get sharp images all around the different sides of the object, trying to keep it in focus. And then it basically constructs, it figures out whereabouts those cameras are and aligns them. So this first little tab button over here is actually the camera alignment and the point cloud that it calculates from the camera position. The other thing that you can do is you can actually look through the camera to check if the alignment is correct. So if we get, say, this camera here, and we right click on here and say look through camera, we can have a look at our textured model that's been finished, and we'll see that that image and that perspective is exactly correct. It's pixel for pixel lined up. So that's our image here, and that's our model from that same angle. So it's exactly correctly lined up the camera and perspective of that model and built the detail. So basically, what you're getting is terrific high fidelity detail of all these organic naturally occurring shapes, which would be very labor intensive to model by hand in 3D Studio Max, Maya, or any other software package. Sure, you could sculpt this up in ZBrush from scratch and get very high levels of detail. However, using photo scanning, the detail and the texture matches on top of itself. Meaning, when you have a look at this surface here on the side, all the roughness that's in the texture here, where there's this part of the rock is sort of sheared off, and this flat section of the rock here where you get these rusty brown colors, is matching the geometry. So exactly where the rough parts are on the rock geometry is exactly where the rough parts are on the rock texture, which is very, very helpful. Not having to manually create textures and create these detailed models in software. So what are some of the drawbacks? Well, basically, photo scanning isn't the silver bullet sort of magical fantasy sort of 3D content creation thing that you would initially hope, because there's a few problems with it. Basically, the first issue is that the geometry that it generates is basically extremely dense mesh of triangles, which won't necessarily work in a RenderMan or another subdivided polygon pipeline, because you really need quad polygon geometry to work in that kind of subdivision workflow. The second problem with this kind of geometry and with photo scanning is that the texture maps that are put onto this geometry don't have unwrapped UVs. They're basically shredded, which is broken up into hundreds of little flat pieces that are basically like loaded onto the model. So this is what the texture maps look like. So they're all the thousands and thousands of little pieces and faces of the model are basically mapped out using the software, which looks great in the viewport, but when you use it in production, it can be difficult to edit and paint over or manipulate the textures. The second problem with the textures is that if you're using it in a VFX production or in a game, the shadows and the lighting are actually baked into the texture maps. So basically, what you have is the light in this particular case is hitting from the top sort of direction up along this angle, and it's casting a shadow on the side of this rock. Now, if in the film or the game that it's being used, the light's coming from this way, it's going to not update on the rock itself. It's actually going to still have that shadow and that light baked into the rock. So part of the process of getting these textures and dealing with these models is you need to remove the baked-in lighting from these scans. All of this is achievable though using ZBrush, which has some fantastic retopology, UV mapping, and basically editing tools for high resolution, high polygon geometry. So basically, the workflow for photo scanning is that you start off with cameras photographed around an object. Then it generates the position of the cameras and figures out where they are. The next stage is it generates a dense point cloud, which is basically like 3D points in space of the model that are colored. And they're great because that allows you to visualize large data sets before you've actually wrapped polygons and textures around them. And these point clouds as well, I would assume that there would be graphics engines which will load the point cloud data into them so that you can actually navigate through dense point clouds without having to put polygons or UV maps or textures onto the objects, because the dense point clouds can be actually more detailed than polygons with UV maps on them, because they don't actually have any UVs or any polygons. They're actually just colored points in 3D space that are making up the objects of the world, which is actually probably more like the atoms which are in the real world, which reflect light. The next stage of the creation process is it creates a polygon mesh over the top of the object. And then the last stage is you create texture maps on the polygonal object that's been created. And once you've finished those steps, you basically have a 3D object which you can use as an asset in a VFX scene. So you can see here it's got excellent results at creating a small object like this rock, which is probably about 70 centimeters long and about 30 centimeters high. But what if you want to create an entire environment or a whole city street? How would you actually tackle that and achieve that using photo scanning? Because obviously there's a lot of potential there for creating single objects, but what kind of results are you going to get if you want to create a whole area? That's basically the challenge that was undertaken for this training series, was to create a large environment 100 meters long and 55 meters wide, using the same techniques as was used to create this rock. So rather than creating a bunch of separate objects which are all not interconnected, which you then put together into one scene, this took a different approach where you actually scan the entire scene and then see what effects, how that goes together. So let's have a look at the reference photography of the area, and we'll evaluate some of the problems that will come up against using photo scanning for creating the visual effects, and which sections you'll have to create manual 3D for if you were using it for a VFX pipeline. So this is the area that I selected to recreate using photo scanning and traditional modeling and texturing. This is an area in Springbrook in Queensland, Australia. And the reason I chose it was because it has a lot of complicated interlinking natural organic shapes which join onto each other. There's a lot of occlusion in the scene as well, but it's got excellent texture and really interesting shapes in there, especially across these root system. The other thing that was that I thought was interesting about this scene was that it featured a lot of water, which is traditionally very difficult to scan using photo scanning, as well as reflective rocks, thin wiry roots, and a lot of foliage as well. Now, some of the things, there's certain things that photo scanning is really good for, and there's certain things that it isn't good for, which you need to use another method of VFX creation for. One of the things that it's really great at doing is creating textured rocks, these sort of smaller leaves that come off the surface of the rocks, all these fallen leaves on top of the rocks. And what it is struggles to recreate is these sorts of smaller fern type shapes and tiny structures like moss, and the foliage, which is in this background area here, is not going to be reproduced with photo scanning at a larger detail level like this. So if you were able to just do like a tiny little leaf by itself, it's going to be able to do that easily. But if you're going to do an area that's 100 meters long by 50 meters wide, it's going to be very difficult to build up the resolution required of all these translucent leaves using photo scanning. So basically what you have to do is use another technique for creating the foliage, like speed tree or grow effects, or even just using traditional paint effects in Maya. And then for the modeling of all the rocks, the tree roots, the tree trunks, you can use photo scan and max out your detail with that. So in here as well, you've got all the rocks and roots on the ground. We've got the water on the ground, and we've also got these palm tree leaves on the ground. Now, all of these different things will have various levels of success or unsuccess in photo scanning, but it really depends on the detail that you're using and how many meters of volumetric data you're putting into the system at once to be able to use it. The other thing that's important is how to actually break up the scene into different components. So you can see we've got the rocks, which is on the ground. We've got the flat surfaces of the ground, which have these pebbles on them. We've got these root systems, which interconnect into trees, palm trees. We've got the roots of this main tree here, which go across and over this rock. And we've got these smaller plants. And we've also got this reflective water, which is sort of water falling down the sides of this environment and down out the front of the scene. So there's a lot of detail and a lot of complex interlocking sort of ecosystems working all together in this environment. So it's a very challenging scene, and we'll be able to get some interesting results out of it. Here you can see some of the details of the rocks. So you've got this white sort of like lichen colors and mosses on it, as well as all these fallen leaves. And you've also got these the trees with their ferns growing off them and root systems coming out of the ground. And also, if you zoom right into the scene, you've got these very detailed pencil thin root systems coming off the trees, as well as all these little leaves that grow around the base of the trees. So all of this detail, you have to think about what actual level of detail you're going to be able to reproduce using photo scanning, because it doesn't really limit you in your scale of the scene. Like in photo scan, if you want to just create this tiny little leaf here at 10 million polygons with 16K texture maps, it's not going to stop you from doing that. You can easily do that using different photos that you've taken of the scene. However, if you're building a large environment, you're going to need to plan out how you're going to fit the scale of objects into the scene. So this is more details from the leaf, the leaves that are in the things, and there's all these different plant species of greenery and of all kinds of different rainforest trees and rainforest plants that basically are growing along this environment. So all of these different scales and detail of the environment has to be planned and organized into this scene. So let's have a look and see what you can create by photo scanning a large environment. So in this scene, we've got the tree roots out of the scene, which has been isolated off from the rest of the environment to ensure that we get maximum detail out of the model and the texture from this model. Basically, this is going to be one of the class files that we're going to be using, which you can open, and we're going to learn how to create a sparse point cloud from this model and how to align the cameras in this model. We're going to be looking at how to create a dense point cloud, of these roots, and also how to create the model geometry and the texturing for the wood that's on this root system, and basically prepare it for being used in visual effects as a visual effects asset. So that's the tree roots of the scene. So you can see you can get excellent detail from just going around and taking photos of the roots of this environment. So this is the photos that have been used to recreate that 3D model of the root system. Now, if you have a look at a render, which is from another course, which is focusing on lighting, you can see that you can get amazing detail out of the renderers like RenderMan and Unreal Engine of these photo scanned assets once you put them into the scene. So this is all RenderMan renders using simple materials and simple lighting setups for this scene. So you're getting excellent results very quickly from photographing these objects. So basically the great advantage of this, using this technique rather than manually modeling everything, is you can turn it around really quickly. This model here, you can photograph it easily in half a day, which is helpful if it's closer to you where you have your photography equipment. And then you can easily convert this in ZBrush and texture it in another day. So you're looking at probably a 2-day turnaround to be able to bring this from a completely non-existent object into a highly detailed 3D model that you can use in production. Now, for me personally, that would take a lot longer for me to manually model in polygons all this detail of this tree. So yeah, it's an excellent system for creating very detailed assets of complicated natural shapes. Another object that was created was this rocky area. This is a section of the creek bed from the same location, and you can see here you're getting awesome detail on the rocks, and you get that excellent integration between the leaves, the moss, and the textures on the actual rock surfaces. So all of this detail in here is being retained really, really well to enable you to get a very natural interaction between leaves in the water, leaves on the rocks, the wet edges of the rocks, and the moss growing into the crevices of the rocks. So all the detail that you see in real life is being retained in these photo scan recreations. Similarly, on the rocks here, you can see that you're getting excellent detail that looks very non-photoshopped. The variety of texture and leaf placement and cracks and the natural way that it all flows together based off the photography has given it a really realistic feel, which doesn't at all look like it's been hand painted in a texture creation software. It looks definitely like it's from a photograph. So if you have a look at the RenderMan render of that scene, you can see that it's just very lifelike and very natural looking, and it's great for photographic sort of visual effects and game environments. So that's the other scene we're going to be taking a look at, and we'll be able to create a sparse point cloud, a dense point cloud of that scene, and also a textured model of that scene. So that'll be really great because it's a lightweight scene to operate, and it's got really good results in terms of creating textured surfaces that have complex natural surface variation. The other scene that we're going to be having a look at is these trees. And the trees are one of the things that is really, really easy and straightforward to create in Agisoft PhotoScan. It's just perfectly designed software for creating close-up visual effects elements, which you need to put point blank range in front of the camera. So this is basically the sparse point cloud of this tree, showing all the different camera angles that were used to take the photos, and all these photos will be uploaded into the Effects PhD server so that you can use them to create your 3D scene. And then that's the model, the high resolution model of the tree, which is beautifully and accurately detailed. So if you sculpted this up in ZBrush, you'd get similar excellent results if you did it by hand. However, it would be very challenging to match the texture and the geometry over the top of itself unless you're a master 3D texture artist and 3D modeler, because each one of these little spindly roots has got a different colored texture map on it that's all unique. All the thousands of different roots on it are all basically a different texture, and that would just be super, super difficult and time consuming to create by hand. Even the way these frayed little bits of wood are coming off here just looks really, really, really clear and really impressive. And the renders from this guy in the scene, the renders of these trees in the scene look pretty damn good. There's a lot of detail in the color, in the textures, in the geometry, and in physically based lighting renderers, all the different occlusion and reflections and light bleed and things happens for the models, so you get a very convincing image by the end of using that using that asset in a visual effects shot. So yeah, the trees are great to create, and they're very easy to make. And I'll give you the all the images and the scenes to be able to build this together. The final scene is the aptly named mega scene, which is basically 8,950 photos of the entire environment, which have been carefully hand rotoscoped and hand cut out to actually build the entire environment in PhotoScan. So you can see here that it's just got enormous and amazing detail with about 500 million points in the scene. And if we zoom out, you can see we've got that those roots on the ground, the water flowing down, got these trees here. If I zoom into this plant system here, you can see here that you've got even the details like these little tiny leaves on the rocks have all been integrated into the scanning system. So it's just awesome. Like, it's just so powerful, this software, and being able to load large models and huge point cloud data sets into it. So it's recreated, you can see that it's recreated all the roots of the trees coming down into the water, all the rocks in the background, and it's also even created the background scenery, which is these rocks and this parts of the rainforest valley, where it goes up into the top part of this rainforest gully up the top, where it's got this crazy little kind of cove in here of even more trees and more detail and more root systems and things like that. Now, this is all made from modeled and textured from photographs. There's no hand texturing and hand modeling or manual creation of any of these environments so far. This is all just photographs that have been generated into this crazy massive point cloud data set. So you can see here that the rocks look realistic, the tree roots link into the pebbles, which link into the water, and it's all very convincing and very realistic in terms of the ground. Now you can see here the plants and the trees which are up in the air. There's color information from where the foliage is, but it's not, each leaf isn't accurately positioned, and it doesn't reproduce foliage. That's because the leaves move when you're taking the photos, so it can't accurately position them in 3D space. The lighting changes because they have reflective surfaces, as well as the size of the leaves is just really too small when they're in the background of photos. To get high resolution definition on something really small like those leaves, you'd have to be really, really close to the canopy of the trees and photograph each one, which would just be completely impractical given the time constraints of visual effects turnaround. So you can see here that that the leaves on this plant have a fair bit of definition and detail to them, but that's because they were photographed really, really close up at point blank range. So you're not going to get that same detail level on all of the plants in the entire scene unless you are able to photograph all of them really close up from several different angles. So this scene here, the point cloud data is able to be loaded in this huge detailed data set. The only drawback is that you can't actually mesh and texture the entire scene unless you've got a really, 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 really powerful workstation. Even then, if you did this in one single piece of geometry with a single texture map on it, you'd be looking at like a 100K textured image to be able to get the same level of detail as this point cloud has got for all these fine details like leaves and roots and other texture details. And you'd be looking at like 100 to 500 million polygon model, which isn't going to load into ZBrush for being UV mapped and retopologized. So the way that you actually can create whole entire environments using Agisoft Photoscan, where the entire scene from one end to the other is photoreal photo scanning, is actually to break up the scene into 5 meter by 5 meter by 5 meter volumetric chunks of, let's say, matrix level, and basically mesh and texture and focus all the detail in on those little sections. So, for example, for this scene, you can easily get the massive, huge amount of data and texture data and information that's potentially in this scene, and you can jam it into the size of a small little cube area, and then you'll be able to extract the detail that's required for next gen games and visual effects to create a whole entire environment using photo scanning or photoscan level graphics. So what I mean by that is, if you have a look at these images here, the detail level on this tree is good, and the leaves and the root system and the rocks in the background. And if we have a look at the tree roots on the ground, we can see that the textures and the geometry is very detailed, but you can see it's just a little bit starting to come apart really, really close up to the camera. So you wouldn't want to go anywhere under this kind of high level of detail for the geometry. So that size of scene is about 4 meters across by 4 meters in X and Y, and then 4 meters upwards in Z. So you want to cut off trees and make two or three sections for each little part of the scene, so that you're able to mesh and texture that part of the scene. What that basically means is that when you actually go to create the geometry for a section of the environment, you're not actually doing the entire thing. You're actually just doing a piece of it, so that you're able to retain the detail levels and keep them sort of maxed out. So you're getting a 16K texture in a small area of the environment that you're using, which is going to hold up at 4K on a 4K HDR TV. And you want to try and press those UV maps right together on those objects that you're creating. And you're also going to be able to get a 10 million polygon model processed fairly quickly out of Agisoft PhotoScan. And with 10 million polygon higher resolution model, you'll easily be able to bring that into ZBrush and retopologize the model into quadratic polygons and re-UV map the model with no worries at all. And that'll be great for allowing you to then use that, make that high resolution geometry usable in mobile phone applications, next gen consoles, PC games, visual effects for films, and all kinds of other 3D methods. So basically that's the way to do these huge, large-scale environments, is to break it into smaller pieces so that you're able to get the maximum amount of texture and geometry detail out of the master scene that you have. But by all means, you can definitely take 5,000 to 8,000 photos of a large-scale environment and recreate a 3D point cloud, dense point cloud of that scene, and it will integrate perfectly together. So all of the geometry of this scene, the position of the trees, the height of the rocks, is all exactly mathematically correct for the scene. And the way that you can check that is to look at the camera positions out of the scene, and they will exactly match the real life camera positions of the scene. And even if you go back to the location after taking some CG camera angles, you'll see that those CG camera angles exactly match real world dimensions and positions and depth of field and focus, f-stops and everything. So all of this environment is exactly mathematically correct based off Agisoft PhotoScan's amazing reconstruction that it's able to do using the photos. So basically, that's what we're going to be covering in this course is how to recreate these super detailed sections of environments and how you can assemble them together to get maximum detail so that you can build them into these huge, super complex virtual reality worlds that people can basically go through. It's not a simple task. It's a very challenging task. It can be very expensive in terms of time and processing power. But the best way to do it is to focus on a small area like this root system and just do it one piece at a time, so that you're able to build up sections of virtual worlds rather than trying to tackle the entire thing all in one hit. It's very easy to create small little pieces of the and small sections of large environments that you're making, and it's quicker to process, quicker to mesh, and quicker to texture. Whereas the whole entire scene can become very, very slow and it can take an extremely long time to process and to be building sections of any photo scan data that uses the massive amounts of information that you can load into it from 8,000 or 10,000 photos. You're better off using a couple of hundred photos and just focusing on a piece of an environment and then building it up in sections. That's going to be a much more efficient workflow for RAM, memory overhead, disk space, and GPU usage when you're creating virtual environments. Well, I hope you enjoy being able to learn how to use this great software. The next class, we're going to have a look at opening up a scene and how to create a 3D object from photograph.